Good afternoon, everyone. It is Wednesday, July the 29th, 2020. It is currently 4:26 p.m. Central Time, and it's been an absolutely crazy day. It's hard to even comprehend or explain what has happened. Let me do this. Obviously, you all know me, if you're listening to me live or if you listen to this podcast. Obviously, you know me because of the Theology Central podcast. You may know me because of the VBC Bible Institute podcast. You may know me because of the VBC podcast or the Non-Catholic Catholic podcast or the Theological Musings podcast. There's a lot of podcasts you may know me from. And all of those podcasts are obviously theological in nature. They're podcasts where the sermons from this church that I'm currently sitting in are those sermons are posted on some of those podcasts. All of them are theological, church-based podcasts. So clearly, I've never monetized any of those podcasts. Obviously, I'm not going to do that. We're not going to charge money. We're not going to put podcasts behind a paywall. We're not going to do any of that. We're gonna talk about theological issues. We're going to preach sermons. We're going to upload it, and hopefully, we can find an audience that's interested in those types of things. But about 8 days ago, kind of on a personal challenge, kind of a little conversation, nothing really serious. This idea was, why not I create a podcast that's not theological in nature? Talks about a lot of things that I like, whether it's music, movies, sports, just kind of talking about what's currently happening in the world. And just kind of talk about it, and let's just create a podcast. We'll monetize it just for fun. Maybe I can make 75 cents. Who knows? Probably won't be very successful. I can give it, maybe 4 months, maybe 5 months. And once I realize that I wasn't very successful, then I can just delete it. Nobody will ever know that it existed, and I can just go on with my life. And it'll just be kind of a fun little hobby, and we'll see what happens. Well, I created the little insignificant podcast with no promotion, no presence anywhere, no social media, nothing. Just started uploading some episodes. And as of today, in fact, you can still look at it right now. If you open up Spotify and you go to podcast, if you go to podcast and go to charts, right now on Spotify, millions of people use Spotify. This is crazy. My kind of, let's do a little podcast. It's currently the number 3 trending podcast in the United States of America. We are currently on trending in 14 different countries. We're number 1 in the Philippines, number 3 in Canada, number 3 in the United States of America. We were beat out in the United States of America by Michelle Obama's new podcast that debuted today. I think she has a little bit more name recognition than me. But our podcast is number 3 trending in the United States of America. It is hard to even comprehend how that happened. I still don't know. What I'm expecting is that clearly the numbers are going to drop off the cliff in about 24 hours, and we're going to go back to, obscurity and, going to be irrelevant. And by 2 weeks from now, we'll be forgotten. It's just one of those weird things that happened. But because it happened, well, then you're like, okay, what do I do next? What can I do? And so start trying to think like, how can I manage this? Now, the sad part is, when you create a podcast via Anchor, they will sponsor you. What they don't tell you is they have a limit to how much they're going to pay out. And we passed the limit that they will pay out in less than 7 days. In less than 7 days, they notified us and go, you've exceeded the amount that we pay out. Because the initial sponsorship is just kind of like, hey, see, you can make money podcasting. And we blew away those numbers like within 72 hours. So we're waiting. They're supposed to be trying to find us a new sponsor. And then maybe this will turn into something I can make a little money on the side. I don't know. It's just bizarre. So if you have Spotify, that's a great way to listen to us. Just on Spotify, look for the Currently On podcast. Currently On. That's easy. Or if you don't have Spotify, Wherever you get your podcast from, currently on, should be available on all podcasting platforms, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. Subscribe. If you're interested in listening to me talk about music, movies, Taylor Swift, her album, interpreting her video, interpreting lyrics by Juice WRLD, if that's not your thing, then by no means don't tune in, don't listen. But it's just crazy. So I've been processing all of that today, trying to figure out what do I do? How did I end up here? Because it was never the intention. There was no, really, literally, I thought it would be over. I will tell you this, doing a quote unquote, a secular podcast is much easier than doing a theological podcast. In theology, see, this is the thing with a theological podcast. The Christian audience is very much like, wait, you give me my theology my way, or I'm not listening to you. And so you do a couple of episodes where you're critical of, say, John MacArthur, and then boom, I'm never listening to you again. I'm deleting you. You're pathetic. Boom. And you do a podcast and you question, you ask any hard questions about theology, and people get mad because it's like in theology, you got to find that theological lane, and you got to stay in that lane, and you're never to swerve. You're never to deviate. And when you do, your numbers drop. And it's like, well, I'm never going to be super successful in the theological world, but that's okay. That's okay. The theological world is not about success. The theological world is about trying to speak things that you think are important and dealing with issues you think are important, even if people aren't interested in it. Like I've been doing this, virtual road trip to the 25 most influential churches. A lot of people told me they don't like it. But you know what? I think it's important for us to see what's happening in the most influential churches. Whether people like it or not, from a theological perspective, you need to know what's happening because that's really defining what Christianity is. So let's take some time to listen. So you have to make decisions in a theological podcast that in many cases actually goes against your very audience that you want, which is just a weird world to be in. And a secular podcast, you're just talking about, I guess you could have a controversial opinion. It just seems like sometimes in the secular world, they're more willing to listen to someone who, I don't know, maybe that's not true or not. I don't know. Let's just say I'm 8 days into the secular podcasting world, so clearly I'm not an expert. I am years and years and years into doing podcasts, quote unquote, directed for Christians. And trust me, it's been a rocky relationship at how angry Christians get mad at me. And remember, I got kicked off Christian radio. So clearly, I guess I'm feeling the secular world. I haven't got any emails calling me names or threatening me with the eternal fires of hell. So I guess it's a weird world to have that many people listening to your podcast in the secular world and not one hateful email. Christian podcast, it only takes about 5 seconds for people to call you names. So it's a different world. And that's kind of sad, isn't it? And that brings us to our subject, transition. Yeah, here's the transition. Maybe Christians need to learn to exercise more biblical wisdom. Yes, I'm back on that subject again. I know some of you are rolling your eyes going, he's never going to stop talking about it. I believe we need biblical wisdom. If you've been watching the fallout from the John MacArthur controversy, everyone's got a different side. Everyone's calling the other side names. John MacArthur was on Tucker Carlson last night, so it's a big deal, and there are people like, man, he's amazing. And other people are like, yeah, he's so wonderful. Not. And it's like the Christian world is fighting all about that. And if you just even try to offer a very thoughtful, logical, analysis of the situation, you get in trouble. If you even mention COVID-19 and you don't go with full-blown conspiracy theories, you're almost not even welcomed on Christian radio in some places anymore. So it's a weird world, but we do need that biblical wisdom. And so because I keep seeing a lack of wisdom, then I'm going to continue to talk about it because that's what I think people need, even though they maybe don't want me to talk about it. And this week, I know we need to be in Proverbs 3, but we're taking a little detour thanks to the Discover the Word podcast. And it appears they're still on radio. I didn't think they were on radio anymore. I thought they moved everything to podcast. So they're on radio somewhere. Discover the Word podcast. You can listen to them on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. I would tell you to subscribe if you know anything about me and Discover the Word. Look, they do things like a little small group Bible study. It's only 15 minutes long. I don't always agree with their interpretations. I don't always agree with their theology, but it always gets me into the scriptures. And yesterday, we analyzed and reviewed an episode of Discover the Word from the book of James on the subject of wisdom. And it really got me thinking about how we interpret that part of James. I offered kind of my own interpretation. Didn't generate a lot of buzz, but that's okay. I'm going to continue with this topic because today, Discover the Word podcast, they're talking about wisdom again. So we're going to jump right back in and see where it takes us. This episode is called Seeking Wisdom. So let's see what they have to say, what we can learn about wisdom, and let's see if we can develop, a biblical spiritual wisdom that is seriously lacking in the Christian church today. So let's listen and see what we can discover.
Did you know that an estimated 2,000 self-help books get published every year and are the fuel for a $10 billion self-help industry? Well, this in itself raises a lot of questions, but we're pretty convinced, aren't we, that self-help is something we can do. And today on Discover the Word, we're going to talk about self-help and whether something the New Testament writer James wrote fits into this self-help genre. Marty Hahn, Elisa Morgan, and Bill Crowder are at the table and invite you to join the conversation as we continue our series about the wisdom of James, the wisdom of joy. Next, here on Discover the Word. And this is...
I'll throw this out there just as a thought. Do you ever think Christianity is kind of sold as a self-help program? Hey, come to Christ, do this, and you're going to be a better you're going to be a better husband, you're going to be a better wife, you're going to be a better kid, be a better employee, a better employer. You're going to be better. Sometimes Christianity is sold as a way to get better, as a way to improve yourself. And I think that's something to consider, and we could ask how biblical that is or not. But yeah, I think it's something to consider. Let's see what they do with this idea.
Discover the Word, the weekday small group Bible study from Our Daily Bread Ministries, where we are in week 1 of a 2-week series of conversations based in the New Testament book of James. And just so you know, I think by the end of our conversation today, we'll arrive at the conclusion that the wisdom of James and the wisdom of joy that we find there is actually just the opposite of self-help. Now, Mart is leading these conversations with Elisa and Bill, conversations we had a few years ago before Daniel Ryan Day joined the group. And so in this conversation, Martin wants us to think about what is called the serenity prayer. You know, that prayer that says, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I think we'll be helped by seeing how that prayer really reflects an important understanding of what James was talking about in his New Testament letter. And so I'm going to invite you to grab that chair that we keep saved for you at the table with us and be part of today's continuing study of the wisdom of James, the wisdom of joy.
You know, I love what is called the serenity prayer. In fact, we've got that up on the wall in our house.
Do you really?
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
I've always thought it should be the parent's prayer.
Why?
Because it talks about the stuff you can't control and the stuff you can control. And boy, if that's not parenting, I don't know what is.
Right.
And it's also, though, about us. You know, just totally us. Whether or not we have kids, we can't control stuff.
What are we talking? We're talking about a prayer that more
Mm-hmm.
recently, in modern times, has been used within the recovery movement, 12-step recovery movement, Alcoholics Anonymous, Al-Anon. Let's quote it. What is the serenity prayer?
It's, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change.
The courage to change the things I can.
And the wisdom to know the difference.
Yeah.
So what's wonderful about this prayer, if it in fact is wonderful?
Well, there's a sense of liberation there that I don't have to fix everything that's broken in the world. That there are certain things I can have involvement in and some things I leave in God's hands.
Right.
It's liberating.
God, grant me the serenity, the peace of mind, the peace of heart to accept the things I cannot change. And where's the realism of it?
That we can't change everything.
The courage to change the things I
Right,
can.
and it goes on. It doesn't just leave it at that, not just to accept the circumstances of our lives, but then the courage to change the things I can.
It does take courage to
does
change.
take
and it takes
courage.
personal responsibility and ownership.
But the problem is we get those two things all mashed up together, and I guess that's why the part of the prayer that you recited, Mart, is the critical factor, the wisdom to know the difference.
Yeah.
Because sometimes we step over onto God's turf and try to fix the stuff that He alone can deal with, and we ignore the stuff that maybe we ought to be giving attention
And
to.
isn't most of life teasing those two things apart?
It is. Yeah. So we ask for the wisdom to know the difference. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Now, what I find so interesting is the 12-step recovery movement is often thought of as a self-help movement, isn't it?
Yeah, it's been coined that.
It's been coined that. If it's a self-help movement, where does the serenity prayer fit into that?
Well, it misses the first half of the serenity prayer if it's a self-help movement. It misses the understanding of accepting the things I can't change. And truly, in the recovery movement, there is this understanding that there are things beyond us. So it's not all self-help.
Well, it's rooted in the first two steps.
That I don't have control.
I've lost
we
control.
know these way too well, Mart.
But the point is, the recovery movement, for whatever criticism it may have borne, and rightly or wrongly borne, is not rooted in self-help. The whole idea of it is the fact that my life has become unmanageable. I need help beyond myself.
Yeah, if it was just rooted in self-help, there'd be no need for wisdom to know the difference. You just tackle everything
Right.
and go after it all.
Right.
And so then I choose to entrust myself to the care of a loving.
Let me stop right there. Important question. Whether the recovery movement is a self-help movement or not, you could talk about it all day. It does bring in the concept of God, but if you bring in the concept of God and you don't have the true God, is that not self-help? Because a God that you create to supposedly help you is simply a false God that doesn't exist. If you create something that doesn't exist in order to help yourself, it's still self-help because you created it. It's either about the true God or it's about a false God. And so, if people are relying on a higher power that they define and they create, then it's really just a self-help program. I think that you have to look at it from a theological perspective there.
And God is what's behind it. The reason I wanted to talk about this is because James in the New Testament writes a letter in which he, too, is talking about wisdom, our need for wisdom to find perspective on life, especially in the middle of the troubles that come into our lives. But he, too, in talking about it, in writing about it, is very much concerned about discernment, making important choices between
What's in our control and what's not in our control.
Absolutely.
It's the wisdom to know the difference.
Yeah, it is, because we talked about so far in these programs, consider it joy, which is not a feeling, as we've discovered. It's more of a mindset. So take the mindset when you encounter trials that good can come from it.
Right.
When you can't get there, then ask God for wisdom, which will help you have his perspective.
Right. And what James is going to do is take it, I think, a step further. Not only is he concerned about that kind of discernment, but he wants us to be able to discern between different kinds of wisdom.
Okay.
And to see what he means by that, let's go to James chapter 3, because it's really, and God, help me to know the wisdom to know the difference between what? He's going to suggest the wisdom between a right kind of wisdom, a healthy kind of wisdom, and one that will simply make our problems worse.
Okay.
Elisa, would you begin reading? Why don't you read verses 13 through 16 of James chapter 3.
Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good deeds, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom, in quotes, does not come down from heaven, but is earthly and unspiritual, of the devil. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice.
Bill, would you pick it up at verse 17?
But, and of course that's the big word, isn't it? But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace.
Okay, now in the serenity prayer, we're asking God for the wisdom, the serenity, first of all, to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. James is very much concerned about discernment, to know the difference between what?
Well, here it's between the kind of wisdom that is destructive and the kind of wisdom that gives us God's perspective on life. And the things that Elisa was reading in the early parts of that text, bitter jealousy, selfish ambition, arrogance, self-deception, boy, all of those things are, that's not the path that when we're in our right minds, we would ever want to choose.
Now, do those things, though, parallel anything that is in the serenity prayer? Is the wisdom that comes from below, that James calls demonic, where does it come from?
You know what I'm going to, and I know we're not having a recovery session around the table here, we're having a Bible study, but I go to just the whole illness in family systems, in relational systems that comes from codependency, where I start doing your work because you don't do it. And that's the first part of the serenity prayer, to understand what I don't have control of. I don't have control of your choices. And this earthly wisdom tells me I do. This earthly wisdom tells me to keep holding on to the things I can't control. And it tells me you're going to die if you don't step in here and fix your parent or your child or whatever. There's crazy stuff in that. In fact, we talk about in family systems like that, there's a lot of craziness. Crazy people are crazy and we all make each other crazy. So there's something there that helps me to see that this earthly wisdom is going to lead me to take control of that which is not mine.
That's right. I
Does
think
that
you're
make
right
sense?
on it. Bill,
Really?
what were you going to say?
I was just going to say, and those things lead to conflict.
Yeah.
But
Bitterness.
the other kind of wisdom leads to peace.
Right.
Okay.
So there are outcomes here in the midst of the process.
Right. So within again, going back to the serenity prayer, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change. Whereas the wisdom that comes from below, as you indicate, it's all the things we think we can change. We're trying to take control of it.
It's
Or
gonna
all the
keep
things we think we
grasping.
have to change.
Yeah. It's
And
up
as
to
we
us.
try to change it out of our own desires, out of our own flesh, what do? We create
More conflict.
all kinds of conflict, all kinds of trouble.
Isn't it a lot of when we try to change things we can't change? Aren't we playing God's role? Or
Right.
trying to.
Okay, now within James' two kinds of wisdom, where does the second kind of wisdom come from?
It comes from God. I mean,
First
that's
kind-
what he says in chapter 1.
Right. First kind of wisdom comes from where?
Below.
From below, from ourselves, our own desires. Second kind of wisdom comes from
Above.
who?
From the God who is wise, the all-wise God.
Right, which takes us back to chapter 1, where James...
Ask for wisdom, and the generous God will give it to you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
That's powerful. So when I'm trying to
I would say that the wisdom that comes from below, the wisdom that doesn't come from above, he says it comes from us. I think it has three sources. The wisdom that descendeth not from above, James 3:15, is earthly. There is an earthly wisdom. That is a wisdom, a part of the earthly, worldly system. It is a part of this system. It's the way it's part of the world's philosophy, the world's ideology, the world's morality. It's a wisdom that arises from the earthly, worldly, fleshly system that is all around us. Second, it's sensual. That seems to me that it's a wisdom that arises from our fleshly desire. It's a wisdom that is based off how we feel. It's a wisdom that's based on what we desire. It's based on a fleshly desire. Any wisdom that we have about anything happening in the world, happening in your life, if you rely on a wisdom that is based on your feelings, based on your emotion, based on what you desire, that is a wisdom that does not descend from above, and it is devilish. That is a wisdom and think of the devil as being in opposition to God. It's devilish. Any wisdom that opposes the wisdom of God. So you have a wisdom that arises from an earthly perspective, a wisdom that arises from our own sensual fleshly desires, and a devilish wisdom is a wisdom that at its core is in opposition to the wisdom of God. So those I think we should break it down a little bit more. They're trying to keep connecting it back to the serenity prayer, but I think we just need to focus here a little bit, just make sure we get the three areas there about this wisdom. And I think we do need a discernment to be able to draw a distinction between the two. But the problem is having a discernment to go, that wisdom is from above, that wisdom is earthly, that wisdom is coming from inside of me, and that wisdom is devilish. It is very, very difficult sometimes for Christians to do that, because sometimes we'll take that earthly, sensual, devilish wisdom, and we will robe it. We will put a robe of self-righteousness and spirituality around it to hide what's really at its core. And sometimes we can convince ourselves that it's God's wisdom when once you remove the mask, then you see for what it really is.
Keys apart that which I can't control and letting go of it, and that which I can control and stepping up to be responsible. I need to really be discerning about the wisdom I'm going to use to discern that.
Right.
If I'm going to keep trying to hold on, or if I'm going to relinquish.
Now, is it conceivable that there is serenity in either one of these kinds of wisdom? Which one?
There's the wrong kind of serenity in the first kind of wisdom, and it's the serenity that comes from, I've got all the plates spinning on sticks and I can make it happen.
Right, and what is the result of it, though? Is it peace?
No.
Well, the result's disaster.
It's disaster, all kinds of...
Disorder.
Disorder.
But sometimes we feel like we're in control.
Right. The second kind of peace comes from above and comes from God, and what is its result?
Peaceful.
Peace. Closer to relying upon serenity in God.
Yeah.
Now, the second kind comes from where?
Above.
Do we have to produce it?
No. We just rely on it. We ask for it, and it is given to us.
And
we cooperate.
I think one of the most important things as we spend these conversations together, this time together, talking about the wisdom of joy that James talks about, is to realize this is not telling us something we ought to do. It's not telling us what we have to pull off ourselves. Rather, it's telling us that there's something from God that we need to learn how to recognize so we can give him the space and the room to do it in our lives for us. It's the opposite of self-help. Yeah. But it's the courage to trust in God, to ask him for the help that he alone can give us.
Yeah, and I think that did help us to see that what James is talking about is not self-help. It's actually, as Mart said, just the opposite. Well, thanks for being here at the table with us again today.
All right, I'm going to go a different direction. I know they kept trying to turn it back, this opposite of self-help, and that's obviously their theme. My theme that if I was sitting here having my own personal devotion, and in fact, I'm sitting here with my Bible, so this is kind of my late afternoon, early evening devotional time. I take from the idea of discernment when it comes to wisdom. Wisdom in itself is, we would say wisdom brings discernment, and I agree with that, but I think we need a discernment. Can you discern between the right kind of wisdom and the wrong kind of wisdom? That's the question you have to ask yourself today. It doesn't matter what the issue is. For example, we're right now witnessing all of this controversy with John MacArthur, and their churches are going to open, and they're not going to follow the rules that have been handed down. And we sometimes will hear things and it's like, oh, that's our side and we're making a good point, or we're taking a stand. And we can see things from such a earthly, sensual perspective. Sometimes we have to step back and go, okay, let's throw out all the spiritual, the spiritual covering that we're putting on this situation. Let's get down to the very core of it. And when we get down to the very core of it, sometimes we have to ask ourselves a very important question. Is it demonstrating at its core level biblical wisdom, or is it demonstrating an earthly, sensual, devilish wisdom? And that's sometimes we have to ask ourselves about anything happening. If it's a church dispute, if it's a dispute in your family, if it's an issue at work, you got to step back and go, okay, can I discern what the godly wisdom is here for this situation and what the other kind of wisdom is? Can you truly discern it? Churches will fall into absolute disarray and can have a church split. And people are literally fighting over something, crazy, and people are at each other's throats. And it's like, wait a minute. Nobody has the discernment to realize that none of us are demonstrating a biblical wisdom. None of us are demonstrating a godly wisdom, because all there is bitter, envying, and strife, and fighting, and splitting. Aren't you realizing that even though we are acting like we're doing the spiritual thing, even though we wrap it up like we're taking a stand for doctrine, or we're taking a stand for theology, or we're taking a stand for Jesus, or whatever spiritual robe you want to use to wrap it around. At its very core, when you're watching it all unfold, you're like, I see earthly, sensual, devilish wisdom. Do you have the discernment to see? This is the key. Do you have the discernment to see through the spiritual robe that we wrap things in, to see at its very core if it's a godly wisdom that comes from above or an earthly, sensual, fleshly one? Do you have that ability to discern at its core which wisdom is being used? That is the discernment we need. So many times, I mean, it's just crazy the things Christians will say, the things Christians will do, and you're like, and no matter how much you try to convince them, they believe that they're the spiritual ones and they're the godly ones, and you're demonstrating a wisdom that is far from God. You may be able to quote the right scriptures, sound so spiritual, but at the very core, it's not. And that's the kind of discernment we need. Can you discern between the wisdom that comes from God and the wisdom that is earthly, sensual, and devilish? That is the kind of discernment we need to develop, and that's the kind of discernment that we need to use, and then try to get ourselves to carry out and use the right kind of wisdom. All right, I'll stop right there. That was pretty straightforward today. We didn't really get into a major interpretation of a text. They didn't spend a lot of time really interpreting the text. They kind of went with their direction, but I think the discernment issue is the real key for this. All right, I'll stop right there. You can email me at newsif@yahoo.com, newsif@yahoo.com, newsif@yahoo.com. That's newsif@yahoo.com. I'll probably be back on the air here shortly. So continue to listen. And, of course, I'll be here till at least 8 o'clock tonight doing some live broadcasts. So feel free to tune in, and hopefully I can provide you some things to think about today. All right. God bless.